Hi, I'm Wolf Marshall for Starlix, and if you're wondering what Bach's Toccata in D minor has to do with Yngwie Malmsteen's style, consider Yngwie's trademark usage of scale sequences, arpeggios, pedal point, and other devices that we'll be looking at today. Both Bach and Malmsteen share a similar melodic, rhythmic, and harmonic vocabulary and attitude. In this presentation, you'll learn how many of the classical and Baroque idioms can be adapted to hard rock style as we focus on a style which combines the best of 3 centuries of music. And now, before we get started, let me tell you a little bit about the equipment I'll be using. This is a stock Fender 1957 Blonde Stratocaster with a maple fingerboard. These all have stock tremolo systems but stay in tune very well with a few minor adjustments like slightly widening the grooves in the nut and lubricating those points with a good oil like Magic Lube. Also, the string length should be very straight with as few windings as possible on the key. I'll also be using this recently acquired 1962 slab board Strat in a hot pink metallic finish. This, like all the guitars here, has a deglossed or satin feel neck. This is a vintage 1964 L series in a 3-color sunburst, which I generally keep in E-flat tuning, a half step below. To keep the feel consistent, the string diameter on this one is 1 gauge heavier. These 2 Strats both have scalloped fretboards. The first one in white has a custom medium deep scallop by Dave Blackhurst on a flame maple 1976 Fender neck. It's also got DiMarzio HS3 pickups and a Godot tremolo bridge. Like the other Strats you've seen, it has an alder body which is slightly lighter than ash wood. You'll also notice it has a custom fret extension making a 22 fret fingerboard. The second one in cream is a factory prototype of the new Yngwie Malmsteen signature model by Fender USA. It was developed directly from Yngwie's favorite Strat, which he allowed Fender's engineers to inspect and measure backstage at a recent live concert. It has Fender's new non-locking tremolo bridge, DiMarzio HS3 pickups, and an alder body with the 1962 vintage contours. The 22 fret neck is scalloped exactly like Yngwie's neck and has a satin feel non-glossy finish. This guitar is currently still in the development stage but will be marketed for the public soon. Most of the guitars Yngwie plays do have scalloped fingerboards. This means that the wood of the fretboard between the frets is carved out in a scallop or curved shape, somewhat like a semicircle from the side view. These necks allow for a different response and feel when fretting. A lighter touch is required. My effect setup is really unusual because the heart of my studio rack is a rock mount unit which enables you to convert any Rockman amp into a viable preamp. And though it has numerous output possibilities, right now it's patched out in mono into a Yamaha SPX90 and then a Lexicon PCM41 digital delay for a little slapback echo. The amp I'm using is part of the stage rig that I have, and it's a 1971 vintage Marshall 100-watt bass head with the cabinets, which are original. It's the first red one in America, and it's kind of my baby. It's completely stock and signed by Jim Marshall, so it has some historical value. Because these examples are complex and require some dexterity, we'll look at smaller components first. Our program will be divided into 2 sections, one being procedures, in which specific technical elements are isolated for study. For example, I'm going to take a small motif or a fragment, sometimes we call that a sequence, and I'll show you how that works. In the second section, called sounds, I'll play the complete phrase and then break it down into points of interest. As you bring together procedures and sounds for yourself, an understanding of the style is developed. Before we get started, let's tune up. Here's your high E string. Your B string. Your G string. The D string. The A string. And finally, the low E string. Let's start with picking procedures. Here's our first pattern. In this example, the goal is to try to develop alternating picking, which is an important part of articulating a lot of the lines we'll be studying. The idea is to go back and forth, keeping a somewhat rigid pick position, meaning that it should be fairly tight within your fingertips. And try to gradually increase your speed, keeping a nice even tempo. Here's a variation of that technique, so now you can practice adding a new figure to it, rather than just playing one note. What I've done here is added a figure, namely this figure, to the already existing high E being picked. It's important to use this now to define melody, and that's what we're doing. We're trying to accent it, defining melody. Now let's move on to playing scales. That's the form we'll be using to build our scale. It's basically a B minor arpeggio, which is a chord outline, and the scales and the chords are harmonically related, so therefore you'll start to learn that chords and scales have to work together. In this case, we're going to build that scale right within this outline. Here goes. Now let's expand that a little bit farther. You'll notice we're using 3 notes per string. And we have symmetrical action there, meaning that is repeated, which is an easy memory reference. There's the full scale. Now what if we wanted to extend that scale? Let's look at what we do. We'd look at the next position up, which is the adjoining position, starting here on the 14th fret. As you can hear, we've gained an extra melody note. That's one of the reasons and the advantages of shifting positions. So you can go from this position, our original, and shift here to get an extra melody note. Here are 4 examples using that shifting into adjoining scale positions in B minor. In our next section, we have what I call mini etudes. These are very small practice sections to help you build some technique using the devices we've talked about. The first one is an ostinato. I'm going to play an example of an ostinato so you can hear what it is. As you could tell, an ostinato was a definite repetition. An ostinato is a clearly defined melodic phrase which is persistently repeated. Many diverse performers are attracted to the rhythmical possibilities, and it's found in practically every style of music, being that repetition is one way to unite music. Now let's look at another example of ostinato. In this case, I'll be using 3 different patterns. In that phrase, we have the combination of these 3 patterns, the first one being, the second one being, the third one being, all together. That makes it an unbroken line combining the 3 patterns, and it's a great picking workout. Also, it'll involve some stretching with the left hand. Now let's look at our next ostinato phrase. This one involves some scale activity as well as the ostinato. Here's that example slowly. You'll notice in that example we're using some vibrato now. The idea is to use good left-hand vibrato to make the note sing. And what I'm going to do is show you how I got that on the last note. Let's take that note, which is the G sharp. You have to rock the string back and forth in a bending and releasing fashion in order to create that oscillation of the pitch. Now let's look at pedal point technique in the procedure section. As you could hear, there's some repetition involved there too. A pedal point or pedal tone is a variation of the repeated note idea. Here's an example of that slowly. This upper note, the C sharp, keeps getting repeated. And at that point we leave the repetition idea behind. Here's a couple more examples of the pedal point idea. Now here's a different example. Let me break it down a bit for this example. I'll play it slowly so you can see what's involved. Now that example had a dominant sound, but in a minor key. In this case it would be C sharp minor, harmonic minor, but yet the chord sound would be G sharp dominant. Let's look at another example of that in this case. In that example, we have the dominant sound superimposed with a diminished sound against it as well. That means that we're playing a dominant chord in the background, which should be like a seventh chord, and we're using a diminished outline in there. We'll have more on the diminished a little later on. Let me play that for you slowly first. The sequence is a form of melodic repetition, but on different scale steps. This pops up a lot in Yngwie style and classical music in general. It's a great way to wind out a melody. There's a lot of unity in this recurring rhythmical pattern, and also in the duplication of the melodic outline with the added element of variety in the pitch change. I'm going to show you what all that means with this example. Within that example, you could see elements of repetition, namely in this melodic outline. It's repeated here. And then again, 2. And then here, as a surprise, is where our variation comes in. Now let's look at the next example of sequence. This particular sequence is an A minor harmonic minor scale, but let's look at it slowly now and see what other elements are involved. Those are the sequence groups. Notice how they travel across the strings. They're also arranged in 6 tuplets, meaning 6 notes. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Okay? Here's an example of a modulating sequence. This is one in which the sequence seems to travel through other chords, meaning chords outside a key. In this particular example, we're getting into the 4-note sequence. And what that means is we're taking 4 notes at a time, making that a group, and moving them through the different steps. That's where it modulates and comes back in. It sounds as if we're going to the B chord back to the E chord. This being all in E minor with a harmonic minor addition to it. Now let's look at the next example. That's the order of the sequences as they travel up the neck. You'll notice shifting going on, and it also moves through scale steps. In this case, A minor Aeolian. 4-note fragments. Now let's look at that whole section slowly. The descending version of a sequence is also sometimes played. Let's see what that would be like in the same key. We'll use the motif up the strings, but we're going to do it in reverse. The last section in the procedures is going to deal with the arpeggio, the broken chord. What we're doing here is we're involved with taking the chord one note at a time and spelling it out. I'm going to pick a B minor and watch what happens. That's a very particular shape that's used a lot in Yngwie's style. It helps to add a little bit of rake picking to that. Now let's see what that would be like combined with a scale. At this point, you should be in the section called Sounds. This should be page 12 in your booklet. We're going to begin using larger phrases now. I'm going to break them down after I've played them and explain some of the elements and the combinations of elements that are involved. Let's look at the first sound, which will be the Aeolian mode. That's the scale. Now let's look at that in a fuller context. We've used 3 adjoining positions to help us increase the range a little bit. Notice that in this scale we have the flat 6th and we have a natural 7th. So this is important to bear this sound in mind because we are dealing with sounds here and the application of sounds within the line. Now here's the first example for the Aeolian mode. Now here's that example slowly. In that example, there were obvious elements of arpeggio, scale activity, and sequence here. Also, so we've seen 3 of our procedural elements there. Scales, also we've seen the arpeggio, and we've also seen the sequence within one line. Now here's the second lick for the Aeolian mode. Here's lick number 2 for the Aeolian mode, played slowly. As you could hear, there were elements again of sequence, this time involving vibrato. That's a variation, as well as sequence here. Coming back around on a scale shape. Finally, we have just fast scale activity in the middle. Now here's the third lick for the Aeolian mode. Here's the third lick in the Aeolian mode, played slowly. Within that line, you could hear elements again of the sequence, particularly here. And that's a sequence all going down one string, so you really can flatter your picking hand in this case. It really favors that picking hand. Also, we have sequences in larger groups here. Those are directly imitated across the board, as well as the beginning of this pattern. And then finally at the end we have a bluesy little choppy bend in which the bend is held while you pick, finally released with a vibrato for the conclusion of the line. Now let's go into the harmonic minor scale for our next section in sounds. And here it is in descending form. Let's expand it. And here's our first lick in the harmonic minor scale. In this example, lick number 1, what we have is an F-sharp harmonic minor scale going straight down to begin with. Again. Then we have a series of diminished arpeggios, and these come directly from the harmonic minor scale. And finally the coda being that same first lick. Now let's look at lick number 2 in the harmonic minor scale. In this example we have a couple of double-handed techniques. Mainly we're following the harmonic minor scale with our right hand. And at the same time we're pulling off and trilling with the left hand. So the effect is this, slowly. And the idea is to leave that note bent and hanging at the end. Now here's the third lick in the harmonic minor scale section. In this third lick, what we've got is a series of position changes that go up the E minor scale. You'll have to notice that there are certain forms that keep repeating, and these will be an aid to you visually to keep place on the neck. The first one is this form, which repeats here. And finally, one more time, and the last one. Now here's the lick slowly. Now let's go on to the Harmolian scale. Now in this scale position, what we've got is really the combination of two of our previous forms, harmonic minor and Aeolian. So I'm coining the phrase Harmolian just as a way of keeping track of that. It's really a synthetic scale of 8 tones as opposed to our normal 7-note diatonic scale. What you do is you include the raised 7th and the flatted 7th in a chromatic series like this. And ascending. Here's how it worked with the scale. Now let's go on to our first lick in the Harmolian scale. Now here's that lick slowly. important thing to bear in mind about this lick is that there are particular phrases that move down the same string in our sequence style. And these are ways of connecting positions up. Then finally we have this symmetrical fingering phrase. You see how the fingering repeats? And then again, settling into this fingering, and finally it closes out with that fingering repeated 3 times. Now here's the second phrase in the Harmolian mode. In this lick we have a lot of different elements that we've studied so far. We have the arpeggio of E minor, as well as we have a straight scale sequence. So that scale sequence just simply went all the way down the scale and back up. And we used both notes, the chromatic tones, right next to each other from the Harmolian mode. Now let me play the entire lick for you slowly. Now let's look at lick number 3 in the Harmolian mode. This is almost a pure scale sequence, but if you'll notice, certain notes are D sharp and other notes are D natural, indicating the presence of that Harmolian mode within this line. Let's look at where those notes change. Here it is slowly. Now you'll notice the presence of both D and D sharp within that line. And what that means is we're using those notes but in different points in the line. Now let's go on to our next area of sounds, the diminished. Those 4 symmetrical shapes give you a good demonstration of how a diminished chord moves and how it acts in the key. Particularly, we have the movement in minor thirds, like I was saying before, of 3 frets away. 1, 2, 3, and here's our repetition. So that means you can move this fingering every 3 frets. If you'll notice, that lick is very similar to what we had in that harmonic minor passage of where we move that shape up in that format. Now let's look at how that could function as a dominant sound. Here's A7 as a reference point. Now an A7 chord can also work with a diminished sound. I'm going to show you how that fits. First of all, I'm going to play the A7 arpeggio. And you'll notice these 3 notes are part of a diminished triad. Now let's look at the whole thing, how it could fit up the neck. Again, notice our minor third movement, and that can work against an A chord. Now here's the first lick for the diminished sound. As you'll notice, there was a lot of symmetrical motion in that lick. First of all, we start up here and we move it down in minor thirds. Then we have the diminished arpeggio all the way across. And now we break it up into a broken chord format. Now this is a little bit of a trickier figure because you have to get your fingers out of the way as you shift. So you're trading off constantly hopping from those positions. Now here's the second lick in the diminished sound. This is a case in this lick of the D harmonic minor functioning with the diminished. Even though this lick is in the D harmonic minor scale, we have a tremendous amount of outlining of the diminished chord, which sounds like. You can hear that outline. You're beginning to get that sound in your head. Now let's hear that slowly. And it's answered by. Now here's the third lick in the diminished sound. Okay, in that lick, what we've done is we've skipped up the string in minor thirds. Kind of the reverse of our first pattern, which was. Now we're taking it the opposite way and skipping up minor thirds all the way. Then we're going straight down the arpeggios and adding a touch of whammy bar phrasing to give it some color and some definition. Now let me play the entire lick for you slowly. Now here's the next section, arpeggios. In this phrase, we have three passages in the arpeggio shapes. Let's see what they are. The first one in A minor moves right into this passage, and finally reaching up to here. These are the three arpeggio positions. This is actually an extension, could be seen as part of the same position, but we're looking at it as already moving into the higher position. Let me play those three for you again. The first half. Now here's the second half. Now on the end of that we have a bend with the first finger, which is a little tricky, especially considering we had a pull-off right before it. So this element should be practiced by itself. It should make a good exercise for your first finger as far as bending strength. Now here's the second lick for the arpeggio section. In this second lick, we're continuing the idea of the staggered broken chord, particularly in this outline. Which we're playing with a triplet type of phrasing. Triplet, 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 triplet. Then we're coming right back up. And at this point we begin a neighbor note sequence. And what that means is we look at the arpeggio outline, and below it we have what we call a lower neighbor. When you look at just that arpeggio, you can see that it's just these notes. But this adds a little more color. And now, here's the third lick for the arpeggio section. In this particular exercise, we can see that we have three different positions related to chords. The first one being this E minor chord, then this E minor chord, and finally this E minor chord. And last of all, our repetition, which is an octave higher than. So the pattern would go like this. You can see the chord positions spelled out one by one as we go through them. This is called inversion, and it's a very important part of playing a chord style arpeggio. Well, I hope you've enjoyed this overview of Yngwie's style and the classical rock style in general. As the closing credits roll, I'm going to give you some titles of some books that you can continue your studies with. There'll be violin books, various organ books, all from the classical vocabulary. The thing that you should do is make up your own transcriptions and build your own classical style. That's the only way you can ever have any individuality and not become a clone of someone else. The idea is to have your own vocabulary in this style, not to imitate somebody else. Emulation, not imitation. That's what made the classical composers great, and that's what'll make you great.